first century, dikaiosune. So, you could say that this letter is about the righteousness of God. You could say this letter is about the justice of God. So when Paul talks about, say, the power of the gospel in Romans 1:16 and 17, you got that there?
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah, he's saying, let me think, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it, the justice of God is revealed through faithfulness for faithfulness. As it is written, the one who is just will live by faithfulness. So in the gospel, the justice of God is revealed, he is saying.
But why would anyone be concerned about the justice of God in Rome? Wouldn't they just assume that God was just? After all, he's God.
Look, you got to remember, this is a community undergoing deep suffering. I don't actually think that those Gentile Christians were avoiding suffering by not welcoming in the Jews. I think they probably experienced some suffering, and that's why they didn't want any more of it. That's why they wanted to keep the Jews kind of at bay. And so, because they're undergoing this deep, deep suffering, and because they're undergoing persecution, they're concerned about justice.
So is that why Paul has that bit in chapter 5 about how suffering produces endurance, endurance produces character, and character produces hope?
That's exactly it.
And then why he talks in chapter 8 about how persecution or the sword or the rulers, none of these things can separate us from the love of God in Jesus Christ?
That's right. But if you look at chapter 8, I mean, why don't you... I just happen to have my Bible here next to me.
You don't just read the paper at coffee shops.
No. I read, you're losing things.
Yeah, I know. I always stuff in there.
I mean, if you take a look at chapter 8, he also has there, verse 35, he also has famine and nakedness and peril. Not just persecution and a sword. I mean, it's the early Christian community. For them, allegiance to Jesus meant they couldn't participate in the religious ceremonies that their trade associations held, right? And so they'd go into their association meetings, and they had to belong to these trade associations in order to work.
Kind of like a closed shop union?
Kind of like a closed shop union, exactly. Yeah. And because they wouldn't participate in the religious rituals anymore, they were excluded. And that meant they couldn't work. And suddenly, because they were Christians, hunger and famine were a problem. And if somebody reported them, so was the sword.
Well, maybe I'm getting mixed up with the Gospels here, but doesn't Paul also have something about loving your enemies?
You're right, you are getting mixed up. That's Jesus who said, love your enemies. What Paul said is, bless those who persecute you, and provide food and drink for your enemies. That's in Romans 12.
So those Romans, those non-Christian Romans who were causing them all this suffering, those are the ones that they were supposed to invite in for a meal?
Well, yeah. If you look at Romans 12, that's what Paul says they're supposed to do.
I thought you said this was about justice. That's hardly justice. I bet that what they would like to do is to keep their eyes out for some lonely Roman soldier and, kick the crap out of them, whenever they got a chance. I mean, no. Well, I'm sorry, maybe you don't like that kind of language, but come on. I mean, people are angry, right? And that would be justice. So they'd like to beat them up.
Okay. That would be Roman justice, or maybe American justice, or Canadian justice, or British justice, but it's not the justice of God.
The justice of God. What's that got to do with it?
Well, that's where we began. Remember? Romans 1, the justice of God. I mean, the community is asking exactly this question. Here they were. They're being beat up. They're being taken off to the Colosseum. They're being burned at the stake. They're being thrown to the lions. They're losing their work. And they're saying, so where the heck is the justice of God? Well, God's justice, God's righteousness had to do with his covenant faithfulness to his people. That's another way to translate dikaiosune.
Covenant faithfulness.
And when God came in justice, according to the scriptures, if you read the Psalms, if you read Isaiah, when God came in justice, he would overthrow all those idolatrous nations that were oppressing Israel. He would save them from their enemies. He would vindicate them. He would show them who was truly God. That's what they were expecting. They were asking that question.
Okay, so when God's people aren't being saved, when they're just suffering and suffering and suffering, they want to know why God isn't acting in justice on their behalf. They want to know why God isn't kicking the crap out. They want to know why God isn't defeating their enemies.
Exactly. But you know what? We know that God has a different way of dealing with enemies.
You mean that stuff in Romans 12 about feeding them and giving them something to drink and blessing them and all that?
There's that. And then there's also Romans 5. If you go back to Romans 5, the Romans 12 stuff is clear. Listen to this in Romans 5. It sounds like one of these theological bits. Let's see, where is it? Verse 10. For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more surely, having been reconciled, we will be saved by his life. While we were enemies.
While we were enemies. I mean, do you mean to say that because God forgave us while we were enemies, that means that we need to forgive our enemies? Mm-hmm. That kind of sounds like the Lord's Prayer, doesn't it?
It does. And that's the justice of God.
Now, wait a minute. That can't be justice. Let's call it mercy or forgiveness or something like that, but it can't be justice. Justice means getting your just deserts, getting what you deserve. Isn't that what the President of the United States meant when he first called the war on terrorism Operation Infinite Justice?
Justice means getting what you deserve. Do you want God to give you what you deserve?
Well, not exactly.
This is the justice of God. This is the new ending of the story that the Roman Christians have to get used to it. This is something new. That God isn't going to come and, well, I'll use your language, that God isn't going to come and kick the crap out of their enemies, as you so picturesquely put it, but that God's forgiveness extends even to the enemy. And it's hard for them to believe this, because everything around them tells them that justice doesn't work this way. I mean, you just said justice doesn't work this way. I mean, they lived at the heart of an empire, well, that prided itself on justice. The Romans felt that they were bringing justice, not only justice, but also civilization to the whole of the world. I mean, the Romans had an Operation Infinite Justice, if you want to use that phrase. But their story of justice meant that those who were friends of Rome, that is, those who didn't resist Roman rule, were treated with leniency. And those who were enemies of Rome, that is, those who might want to defend their own homeland or defend their own laws, those who resisted occupying forces, they were crushed to the ground with Rome's military might. I mean, that's Roman justice. The Christians in Rome, they knew about Roman justice. And they had to learn that God's justice was completely different.
Sounds good, but what about their suffering? I mean, they've been hung out to dry with no answer to their suffering.
Well, that's why Romans 8 is so important. I mean, take a look at Romans 8. What is it about except their suffering and the suffering they're going through? You see, the Christians in Rome are surrounded by a story that's all about winning. Who has conquered? Who has been defeated? And those who are the conquerors, well, they're the winners. They're the ones who are blessed. If you win, then God's on your side. That was Rome's story, and you know what? That was often